Damn it, she's just the janitor. That was what every SEAL had silently thought about Isabella for 2 long years. She was the invisible shadow within the base, only noticed when she picked up spent shell casings or patched up the torn targets. No one cared who she once was, nor did anyone bother to ask what she knew beyond sweeping floors and scrubbing benches. But sometimes, the greatest warriors hide within the very form that others dismiss as worthless. And everything erupted on the day the base came under attack when a single fateful bullet forced the truth into the open. In the unforgiving world of Coronado, every movement revolved around discipline, speed, and lethal efficiency. From the first light of dawn until the sun sank into the California coast, the crack of gunfire echoed like the heartbeat of the entire base. Targets riddled with holes, the lingering haze of gunpowder, the shouted commands of steel-willed men, all of it fused into a scene that made anyone who stepped inside feel small. And yet, for 2 years, there was still one person who walked quietly through it all as if she didn't belong there at all. Her name was Isabella Tran. If you asked anyone in SEAL Team 7 about Isabella, the answer would usually be summed up in 3 words: the janitor. She showed up on time every morning, toolbox in hand, gloves reeking of grease, and disappeared once everything was cleaned and set in order. No one noticed that, to patch up a torn target, she had to crouch among hundreds of smoking brass casings. No one cared that sometimes she needed both a hammer and a steel ruler to straighten a target frame, twisted by bursts of automatic fire. In their eyes, she was nothing more than part of the facility itself, durable, silent, and not worth mentioning by name. SEAL Team 7 was known as one of the toughest, most battle-hardened units on the base, faces that had survived Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, all present here. They carried the scars of combat, the glint of polished metals, and a dismissive attitude toward anything that didn't belong to real war. In that atmosphere, Isabella was nothing but a shadow slipping by, leaving no impression beyond the faint scent of bleach lingering on the floor. Her work ticked along with the precision of a clock, replacing shredded targets, scrubbing down wooden benches scorched by muzzle flash, sweeping up mountains of brass glinting under the sunday. Sometimes, the men joked that if brass could be sold by weight, Isabella was probably the richest scrap metal mogul in San Diego. She would give a faint smile, never answering. Silence, for her, was safer than explanations no one wanted to hear. The irony lay in the fact that every day she was surrounded by rifles, by drills measured in millimeters of accuracy, yet no one had ever asked whether Isabella herself knew the feel of a trigger. To the SEALs, she was nothing but background, like the paper targets that got shredded and replaced. Some even joked, if one day the targets learned to walk, they'd probably be more useful than the janitor. Words tossed carelessly, but in Isabella's heart, they cut like a knife. From Captain Michael Harrington's perspective, her presence mattered even less than the trucks hauling ammunition. At 40, built like iron, he had led dozens of dangerous operations. For Harrington, life was a chain of mission success measured by how many returned home and how many soldiers survived. In his philosophy, a maintenance worker like Isabella was no more than a small cog in the logistics wheel, useful, necessary, but never worth talking about. On ordinary days at Coronado, Harrington could pass Isabella 10 times without lifting his head. It was the habit of a man who lived among elite warriors, where a person's worth was measured only by combat achievements. Isabella, a young Asian woman with a headscarf, hands stained with grease, had nothing that could catch his eye. And yet if you watched closely, you might notice something different in the way she worked. When changing out a target, she often stood still for a few seconds, staring through the bullet holes as if analyzing their trajectory. When sweeping brass, her brown eyes seemed to calculate something more than trash collection. Sometimes she lingered at the firing line, staring down the empty range as if recalling an old lesson. But no one cared. To them, That concentration was nothing but the odd habit of a girl too diligent for a job nobody wanted. In truth, Isabella was not saddened by invisibility. There was a certain relief in being left unasked. Questions could lead to answers she wasn't ready to speak. Yet, amid the thunder of gunfire, a quiet sorrow would sometimes rise. Perhaps everything she had once learned, everything she had once endured, would forever remain buried beneath powder smoke and brass. Anyone who has ever felt belittled, underestimated, or locked inside a box others refused to open would understand Isabella's silence. It was both a shield and a cage. People think silence means nothing to say. In reality, silence often hides stories powerful enough to astonish the world. At Coronado, everything seemed unchanging. The SEALs still trained, the targets still got shredded, and Isabella still gathered the remnants in silence. But it would take only one single event to upend the balance completely. Because sometimes, the very thing everyone dismisses as invisible is the only strength left standing when life and death hang in the balance. Mornings at Coronado always began with the wail of the assembly siren, echoing like the steel heartbeat of the entire base. While SEAL teams sprinted through obstacle courses, scaled ropes, and shouted commands that shook the air, Isabella was already out on the training grounds. The clock hadn't yet struck 5, but her old pickup truck sat neatly parked in the corner, its bed loaded with paper targets, rolls of duct tape, a few wire brooms, and a heavy metal repair kit. Each morning, as the sun pushed a thin line of orange over the horizon, she slipped into her routine, stacking boxes of ammunition, replacing torn targets, sweeping away the scatter of brass casings that littered the field like worthless coins. Sometimes, there were so many that, if gathered by weight, she could have opened a scrap shop in town. The thought passed through her mind with a faint smile, a private joke to make the long day feel less monotonous. Yet to the young SEALs, that sight was nothing memorable. They saw her as nothing more than a faint shadow, existing only for the sake of steady employment rather than any deeper purpose. One muttered once that Isabella probably knew more about the holes in a target than about the rifle itself. The chuckle that followed dissolved quickly into the sea breeze. No one noticed that her smile was fleeting, and inside, the remark cut quietly where no one cared to look. That feeling of being dismissed had become part of her daily life. When a person grows accustomed to being labeled invisible, they train themselves not to react. Silence becomes a cheap but effective armor, blunting the arrows of prejudice before they pierce too deeply. Isabella understood this well. She chose silence, knowing that answering back only invited louder laughter. Perhaps it was that silence that made her the perfect canvas for others to project their unchecked assumptions. In the eyes of the SEALs, women at Coronado existed only in supporting roles: medics, logisticians, administrative staff. An Asian girl in worn-out shoes, her shirt streaked with dust, had even less reason to be considered capable of anything beyond scrubbing. Sometimes, while crouched over a broken target frame, Isabella caught whispers drifting across the range. A rookie once muttered, "If she ever fired a rifle, we'd run out of ammo before she hit the target." To them, it was harmless banter. To Isabella, it touched the deepest chamber of pride, the place she kept hidden, the place nourished by lessons no one here even knew existed. But instead of arguing, she carried on, calm as ever. Her brown eyes traced the shooting lanes with quiet precision as her hands pressed tape against torn paper. Beneath the weariness of her frame lay a patience forged since childhood, though no one cared to see that far. Facing a world that refused to believe in her, Isabella chose to let time speak in place of any defense. The bitter humor of her story lay in its irony. Every day, she was closer to firearms than most people could dream to be. She polished stocks, stacked ammo crates, repaired shattered frames, yet not a single man in the unit ever asked whether she had ever squeezed a trigger. It was like living your whole life next to a grand piano, while no one ever imagined you might know how to play. Once, a senior officer walked by and saw Isabella carrying a target stacked nearly twice her body weight. He laughed. With strength like that, not enlisting is a waste. The words sounded like praise, but in his eyes, they were nothing more than a jest. Isabella only smiled and kept walking. She knew that even if she tried to explain, they would only think she was looking for attention. Behind her quiet endurance, she recognized she was trapped in a loop. Arrive early, clean, leave silently. Every day predictable as the timetable of a commuter train. Yet within the monotony, there were fragments of beauty that held her together. A morning when the ocean was glass clear, sunlight shimmering on thousands of brass casings. Or the wry thought that she was probably the only one in the base who truly knew where all the dirt was hiding. Those small fragments kept her from disappearing entirely. They helped her endure the smirks, the dismissive glances, and the reality that, to everyone else, she was nothing more than the janitor of the shooting range. There was one thing no one at Coronado knew. Behind Isabella's dust-stained gloves and worn work jacket lay a towering military legacy. The man she still called Grandpa Dan, who once sat with her on the porch of a weathered wooden house in Montana, was not an ordinary farmer. He was Sergeant First Class Daniel Tran, known by the call sign Spectre, a legendary sniper of the U.S. Army Special Forces during the Vietnam War, credited with 121 confirmed kills. But instead of medals hanging on the wall or heroic portraits in uniform, what he left Isabella was an invisible inheritance, the art of marksmanship as a philosophy of life. To him, the rifle was nothing more than a tool. It was the mind, the breath, and patience itself that were the true weapons. Isabella's childhood was bound to the windswept ranch in Montana, where horses grazed freely on open fields and the whistle of the wind across the eaves played like an endless song. While her peers played with dolls, she lay in the grass with her cheek pressed against the worn wooden stock of her grandfather's rifle. Together they aimed at soda cans set 100 meters away. Each time she hit the mark, his laughter would echo, and he would call her by the nickname Little Hawk. He taught her to listen to her heartbeat, because when it raced, the bullet would wander. He taught her to read the wind through a blade of grass, to calculate trajectory by the way the sun cast its shadows on the ground, and above all, he taught her patience, something he believed even many seasoned snipers never mastered. On winter mornings, they would lie for hours in the frozen mist waiting for the perfect moment, and when the shot finally rang out, he would nod, not in praise of her skill, but of her resolve. That was the inheritance the Army never gave her, but one that already flowed in her veins. Yet when adulthood came, Isabella could not carry that legacy into the official path. She knocked on the Army's door with nearly perfect test scores, shattered shooting records, and even a degree in ballistics from the University of Montana. But all of it crashed against a cold wall: gender prejudice. Recruiters shook their heads, offered polite smiles, and suggested she choose more appropriate specialties. Worse still, the innovations she contributed in the lab were stolen by male colleagues. Her research on ballistic calculations in shifting winds appeared under someone else's name. Her achievements were set aside, while praise and recognition were handed to others. It was as if the entire system had been designed to smother the efforts of any woman who dared to enter a field they had already declared belonged only to men. When the doors to the front lines slammed shut, Isabella was pushed to the margins. Instead of training with snipers, she was hired to maintain the firing range, a bitter paradox. She knew she could outshoot most of the men training before her, yet her task was to scrub the very rifles she could master. It was like a violinist forced to polish instruments without ever being allowed to play a single note. For the SEALs at Coronado, her role only confirmed their assumptions. If she truly had talent, why was she just cleaning? They never knew that the answer lay in the very injustice they were complicit in ignoring. What kept Isabella going was the memory of her grandfather. Each time she bent to pick up a spent casing, she heard his words, A good marksman isn't the one who shoots the fastest, but the one who can wait the longest. At Coronado, she waited, not to prove herself to them, but for the moment when her skill could no longer be overlooked. Sometimes, during breaks, she quietly traced the trajectory of a bullet across the sea breeze in her mind. She did it not to show off, but to remind herself of who she truly was. The jokes whispered behind her back, the scornful glances, all of it taught her another profound lesson: humility. For if a hawk truly wishes to soar, it must also know when to stay hidden. At times she found the irony almost comical. The granddaughter of a man who once made battlefields hold their breath, now fumbling with a mop bucket and a broom. But then she would laugh to herself, because she knew that in the game of fate, sometimes the strongest card is the one kept closest to the chest. Isabella never told anyone at Coronado about her grandfather, partly because she knew they would never believe her, partly because she did not want their pity or cheap admiration. She chose silence, leaving her past in Montana, like a secret she kept close. But deep inside, she knew, one day, circumstances would force her out of the shadows. And when that day came, no one would look at her as the invisible janitor ever again. Dear audience, grab a glass of water, take a moment to relax, and keep listening to the story. The twists are still to come. And please drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a joy to see who's joining us from around the world. Drop a 1 in the comments if you find this story gripping, so we can keep bringing you more captivating tales. That day began like any other morning. The Pacific Ocean sent its salty breeze across Coronado, carrying with it the steady rhythm of waves against the shore. On the training grounds, Captain Harrington's SEAL team launched into their urban combat drills, moving swiftly between concrete blocks, boots pounding against the earth, rifles cracking in sharp bursts. 700 meters away, Isabella was replacing a shredded target, her calloused hands pulling sheets of white paper to cover the bullet holes from the last session. But at exactly 8:47 a.m., everything shattered. An explosion ripped the air apart, shaking the ground beneath their feet. A column of black smoke curled skyward from the administrative building. Seconds later, heavy gunfire erupted from the hills encircling the base. Bullets hissed through the air like razors, followed by the clang of ricochets, the crash of shattering glass, and the shrill overlap of screams and emergency radio calls. Enemy forces have breached the perimeter. Estimated 12 to 15 hostiles. Sniper support confirmed. The frantic voice over the radio spread like wildfire, the chilling realization striking everyone at once. An American base, on American soil, was under attack. SEAL Team 7 found themselves in an unthinkable trap. Pinned under fire so precise it felt surgical, 2 men fell in the first minute, their blood spreading across the dirt they had sprinted over seconds before. Harrington ordered his men to find cover, but rounds tore in from multiple angles, shredding any place of refuge. The paper targets Isabella had just put up disintegrated instantly, white scraps scattering like torn wings of small birds in the choking haze. Time became their cruelest enemy. Reinforcements were 15 minutes out, but under this storm of fire, 15 minutes might as well be 15 hours. The radio screamed constant updates. Enemy snipers positioned, concentrated fire, possible disguised special ops unit. Everyone knew now they were facing opponents who had prepared meticulously. As Harrington's eyes scanned the map, hunting for a route to withdraw his team, he caught a sight that made him blink in disbelief. Just a few dozen meters away, in the chaos of smoke and debris, the small, familiar figure of Isabella was not curled up in fear or scrambling for shelter. Instead, she moved low, fast, and deliberate, heading straight toward the auxiliary armory at the edge of the range. At first, Harrington thought she was panicking, running blind, but no, her movements were too clean, too tactical to be instinct alone. While other logistics staff scattered desperately for cover, Isabella moved like a phantom, sliding across open ground, using the terrain as if she had been trained for it all her life. A burst of gunfire ripped the air, blasting concrete to shards inches from her side. Dust exploded in every direction. But Isabella didn't falter. Her hand clutched the strap of her heavy tool bag, her body pressed flat against the earth, moving with a precision that seemed rehearsed 1,000 times. Then she disappeared behind the metal door of the auxiliary armory. Moments later, before Harrington could process what he had just seen, the same figure emerged again, but this time she was not carrying a broom, not duct tape, not a repair kit. In her hands was an MK-11 sniper rifle. The SEALs, pinned under smoke and fire, froze in disbelief. In the middle of hell itself, the woman they had dismissed as nothing more than a janitor stood upright, her posture transformed, spine straight, eyes sharp, each step steady and sure, as if that weapon had always been meant for her hands. There was a bitter touch of humor in the thought. After all these years, they had handed her thousands of rifles to polish, but never once imagined this sight. The woman they had jokingly called the janitor was now walking with the presence of someone who truly belonged to the battlefield. Harrington held his breath. He had led men through death valleys in the Middle East, had seen soldiers steady themselves under fire, but never had he seen that same unshakable calm on the face of a maintenance worker. There was something in Isabella's eyes that chilled him, not fear, but the very same steel he had only ever seen in those who had spent hundreds of hours waiting in the silence of war. She did not run toward the SEALs for protection. Instead, Isabella made for an abandoned observation tower, one that commanded a clear line of sight over the battlefield. Every step she took, even under the hail of bullets, was measured, exact, and almost impossible to believe. The entire team watched her, and for a fleeting moment, an eerie silence fell over them, the silence of men witnessing an invisible mask fall away. Isabella was no longer the girl who picked up brass. Something greater, fiercer, had just risen from the shadows they had ignored for far too long. Bullets still screamed through the Coronado sky, tearing it apart with every passing second. With each heartbeat, SEAL Team 7 sank deeper into a deadly stalemate. Yet atop the observation tower, a starkly different image appeared. Isabella, the MK-11 resting steady in her hands, calm as if the smoke and fire around her were nothing more than a summer rain. She sat down, movements firm and precise, unscrewed the scope cover, adjusted the elevation. Everything was done swiftly, cleanly, in order, not the clumsy fumbling of an amateur, but the flawless ritual of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times in silence. In that instant, Harrington realized he had placed the lives of his men into the hands of someone he had never once regarded as a warrior. The irony was almost absurd. Dozens of officers with years of advanced training, and yet their survival now rested on the shoulders of the girl who once spent her days sweeping up brass. The radio crackled. Harrington's voice dropped into its lowest register. Priority target, the Eastern sniper, range 600 meters. Isabella didn't nod, didn't waste a single word. Her finger tightened on the trigger. A crisp shot rang out, the bullet slicing through the air, vanishing into the distance. Half a second later, the enemy sniper who had pinned the SEALs down for 10 relentless minutes collapsed behind his sandbags. For a moment, the entire range drowned in strange silence, not because the gunfire ceased, but because everyone realized, all at once, what had just happened. The woman they had dismissed for so long had just dropped a seasoned sniper with a single round. Isabella did not pause to savor their stunned faces. She rolled smoothly to her next target, breath steady, eyes sweeping through the scope like a machine. This time, it was the gunner on the northern ridge, the one blocking reinforcements. The distance was longer, the wind shifting. But to her, it was nothing more than a problem already solved. The rifle cracked, and the enemy toppled, his heavy machine gun clattering from the tower. On the ground, a few young SEALs stared wide-eyed, muttering disbelief. One even let out a sharp laugh, not from humor, but from shock so overwhelming it had nowhere else to go. In the middle of a battlefield inferno, they were witnessing a cruel reversal. The invisible woman was now their eyes, their hands, and their shield. Harrington had no doubts left. He fed target after target through the radio. Isabella answered with precision that chilled the spine. A mortar spotter, then a rifleman hidden behind a concrete barricade. Each shot peeled away another layer of the enemy's carefully planned assault. Every squeeze of the trigger not only saved the SEALs' lives, but exposed the enemy's entire strategy piece by piece. Even amid the tension, there were moments that pulled out unexpected laughter. When Isabella's fourth bullet threaded a sliver-wide gap between two wooden shields, a soldier whispered hoarsely, "If she's just maintenance, then I'm only qualified to wipe cafeteria tables." The strangled chuckles that followed carried with them a release of pressure, a breath of light in the storm. Time seemed to stretch thin. In just 20 minutes, Isabella accomplished what an elite unit of commandos could not, dismantling the enemy shooters who had them pinned. Each bullet she fired was like a scissor snipping away at the invisible ropes binding them, until at last the team could lift their heads again. When the sixth round left her barrel, the final target, the enemy commander, crumpled to the ground, and the battlefield fell into sudden, absolute silence. The attackers scattered northeast in panic, leaving behind the wreckage of their failed assault. In that instant, Harrington knew it wasn't just his team that had been saved. It was a truth made undeniable. Sometimes, the strongest warrior is the one no one ever thought to notice. Isabella lowered the rifle, slipped off her headset, her hands perfectly steady. Her composure was so absolute that those who had once dismissed her found themselves unnerved. They glanced at each other, then back to the observation tower, where the small figure still stood tall amid the haze, as though she had belonged there all along. The gun smoke slowly lifted, revealing a training ground scarred with bullet holes and stained with dark streaks of blood. Atop the observation tower, Isabella removed her headset and lowered the MK-11. Her fingers did not tremble. Her eyes carried no trace of triumph. There was only calm, the calm of someone who had simply done what had to be done. She descended the iron steps, each clang of metal ringing sharply into the silence. At the base of the tower, the SEAL team stood waiting. Their faces were still smudged with soot, their eyes bloodshot from strain, yet all of them followed her with their gaze. These were men who had once regarded her as a shadow, but now they stood as if in the presence of a superior officer. No one spoke, yet the silence itself echoed louder than any applause. In the mix of shock and reverence, Harrington stepped forward. He was not a man given to displays of emotion, but even he had to admit a truth. Without Isabella, his team would have been annihilated in less than 15 minutes. Part of him felt gratitude, part of him confusion. For 2 years, this woman had walked the same grounds as his men, and he had never once thought to ask who she truly was. The younger SEALs were practically slack-jawed. They had just watched a maintenance worker eliminate 6 targets with a level of precision even they, with all their formal training, could not guarantee. One of them, Davis, let out a short laugh, a laugh that carried both embarrassment and awe. Guess from now on I'll ask her to teach me to shoot, instead of wasting ammo on paper targets. The team glanced at him, then allowed themselves a fleeting laugh, a fragile but necessary sound after their nightmare. Isabella did not acknowledge the stares. She simply placed the MK-11 on the ground, wiped the sweat from her brow, and slipped back into her old posture, quiet, reserved, understated. But no matter how hard she tried to keep her humility, she could not prevent the truth. The invisible shadow had stepped fully into the light. When the rapid response force arrived, they were stunned to find the battlefield already silent. The after-action report stated clearly, the enemy retreated after their key personnel were neutralized by a single sniper. The name was not listed on any combat roster, just a maintenance worker. The story spread through the base like wildfire, a tale too unbelievable to ignore. By the next day, Coronado's hallways buzzed with whispers. People asked, Who is she? Where did she come from? Some swore she must have belonged to some secret unit. Others joked, if she held a broom that long, maybe even the broom would turn into a weapon. Whether in doubt or in jest, they all shared one thing. No one looked at Isabella the same way again. Harrington called a closed meeting with his team. Not to reprimand, not to explain. He looked at each face, and then his eyes settled on Isabella. In that moment he didn't speak words of thanks. He was a man of iron discipline not given to sentiment, but his gaze was enough. For the first time in 2 years, it acknowledged her as something far more than an invisible worker. Isabella heard the whispers, saw the shift in how others regarded her, but she did not rush to bask in it. She knew true recognition did not come from a single moment of brilliance, but from proving oneself again and again, day after day. Yet deep inside, she allowed herself a quiet joy. At last, her grandfather's legacy no longer lived only in silence. That night, the base returned to stillness. The ocean breeze carried its salty scent, the corridor lights casting pale gold across the concrete. Isabella sat alone outside, her eyes lifted toward the starlit sky. She remembered her grandfather's words, "One day, little hawk, you will have to take flight. And when that moment comes, you won't need anyone's permission." And today, that truth had finally arrived. The smoke of Coronado had long since faded, but the echoes of that day never disappeared. In the after-action reports, one detail was repeated again and again, almost unbelievable. A large-scale, carefully prepared attack had been broken by a single sniper, someone not on the combat roster, not even listed in operational personnel. That name was Isabella Tran. In the closed briefing room when Harrington submitted his report, many senior officers at first assumed he was exaggerating to protect the honor of his unit. But when video evidence, target coordinates, and ballistic data were presented, there was no denying the truth. Isabella hadn't just fired, she had fired like a master. Every shot had purpose, calculation, and decisive impact. Her file, once dismissed as unsuitable, was reopened. The marksmanship scores that had been brushed aside were now reviewed in the shame of those who had signed her rejection. 6 months later, the decision came through. Without the endless steps that usually dragged on for years, Isabella was directly commissioned as a naval officer and placed into the elite sniper program. For her, it was more than a belated recognition, it was the answer to her grandfather's legacy, proof that what he had passed down had not died with time. Captain Harrington became her strongest advocate. In meeting after meeting, he repeated the words that haunted him. That day, Tran didn't just save my team. She taught us that the most dangerous assumption is believing you already know everything about someone. For a man who had lived his entire life inside the iron mold of discipline, this was a profound change, not just recognition for Isabella, but for everyone who had ever been obscured by prejudice. 1 year later, Coronado echoed with gunfire once again. But this time, it was not the sound of an attack, it was training. On the same range where paper targets had once been shredded by bullets, where Isabella had once bent silently to clean and repair, now resounded the voice of a female officer, Lieutenant Isabella Hawk Tran. She no longer wore the faded maintenance uniform. Instead, she stood in crisp Navy attire, her eyes lit with confidence. Before her, rows of trainees, men and women alike, listened intently. Isabella taught them not only how to aim and fire, but also what her grandfather had taught her: how to steady one's breath, how to read the wind in the smallest leaf, how to keep the mind still even when the heart pounds like thunder. What made this class different was that it no longer bore the old lines of division. Male soldiers no longer looked at their female peers with doubt. Female recruits stepped onto the range with the belief that they, too, could be snipers. And Isabella, the woman once pushed aside, now stood as living proof that excellence had nothing to do with labels, only with preparation and opportunity. One afternoon, after training ended, Isabella returned to the old wall, the place where she had once patched targets and scrubbed in silence. On the rough concrete, someone had painted graffiti, the image of a hawk in flight, sharp and fierce. Beneath it, written in white paint, were the words, "Sometimes the strongest warriors are the ones you never notice." Isabella stood there, quiet, a faint smile tugging at her lips. The symbols that had once been a broom and a toolbox had transformed into a sniper rifle in the eyes of a hawk. Past and present merged, closing a circle. No longer a shadow, no longer a joke, Isabella had become the emblem of something greater than herself, a legacy. And as the sea breeze swept across the base, she could almost hear her grandfather's voice. "Little hawk, you have taken flight." And you, my dear audience, brace yourselves for the next twist in this jaw-dropping story. So, before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're truly loving what I'm doing here. And drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a thrill to see who's joining us from all corners of the globe.